55-year-old American Tom Hargrove had been kidnapped by FARC guerrillas. The news quickly reached the authorities, and the U.S. Embassy in Bogota immediately assigned FBI agent Oscar Tejeda to assist on the case.
There were a number of individuals who drove up on the incident as it was taking place, so they reported what they saw to the authorities. And then, just like a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces began to fit together, and it became apparent that there had been a kidnapping and that Mr. Hargrove had been taken.
That morning, when Susan Hargrove returned from running an errand, one of her husband's colleagues was waiting with the bad news. Susan immediately called Tom's brother Rayford in Texas.
Susan called and she said, "Sit down, shut the door, I've got something to tell you." I thought somebody had died, of course, and then she said, "Tom's been kidnapped." That moment on, our world and her world was completely upside down.
I thought, what did I learn in the Army? And I remembered that one thing that the Army stressed was your best chances of escape are as soon after you're taken as possible, especially if there's confusion. But there was no way. I was surrounded by guerrillas. The commander of the roadblock, and he said, "Me llaman Rambo. My name is Rambo." I asked Rambo, I said, "Am I being held for ransom?" And he said, "Yes." I know 8 foreigners who've been kidnapped in Colombia. And of those 8, 2 are definitely dead, and 3 more are almost certainly dead.
After several days' march through the high Andes, Tom and his captors arrived at a permanent camp.
There was a one-room hut up there. On the outside, they put a piece of like canvas across it and a wooden platform, and that's where I stayed. And at night, they would have guerrillas, somebody, 1 or 2, guarding me.
By chance, Hargrove still had 2 blank checkbooks and a pen in his pocket.
I thought, you know, I really ought to start writing down what's happening, even though they're probably going to take it. So I took the checkbooks, I tore out deposit slips, anything like that. So I started writing what was happening. And I had a money belt. I was so fortunate because I had that money belt absolutely packed with diary, with things that I'd written. My diary was the most important thing of all. It's the only thing I had. It's like being taken suddenly and nailed in a box or a coffin. You're left there in the silence and darkness while the rest of the world goes on. A lot of people, they think about guerrillas in South America, they have the idea of a disenchanted intellectual, leftist intellectual who's left the university to fight for the rights of the oppressed. Most were from 12 years old to 19, illiterate or barely literate. The commander of the roadblock where I was taken was Rambo, but after a few days, he rode off, and Huaco was in charge. Huaco was 15 years old. He claimed to have a second-grade education. Viva Huaco! Viva! I heard Huaco tell the troops a couple of times, though, that soon Colombia would be a revolutionary Marxist country like Cuba, China, and Japan. Japan is not a revolutionary communist country. ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva el pueblo! ¡Viva! He couldn't read, he was illiterate. I later learned that he couldn't count. And thinking, boy, Your life's in the hands of somebody who can't even count. A third of the guerrillas were women. And if I had to classify them from the least cruel to the most cruel, I would classify the women in both extremes. The women could really be mean. Malena would do things, and she'd put soap in my drinking water. Now, that sounds like a high school thing, but it wasn't funny at all. I was really, really angry. If God gave me the power of revenge, I'd say, okay, I'd like to take out Malena first. There was nothing to do, nothing to read. You know, if you're in a camp of illiterates, you're not going to find the complete works of Shakespeare around there.
3 weeks after Tom's kidnap, FARC headquarters contacted his wife, Susan.
The family received information in a letter detailing to them how they should proceed, that they should get a low-frequency radio so that there could be communications, and that they should then turn to a particular channel, and then there'd be an interaction over the radio as to how to proceed. The Hargroves found a very competent young man who would serve as their voice over the radio.
The young man was Robert, a neighbor who spoke Spanish with a Cali accent, an important ruse to convince the guerrillas that the Hargroves were not getting professional help. In fact, Tom's brother had hired a specialist British kidnap and ransom company to work in tandem with Oscar Tejeda.
We had to learn what the protocol was. So from that point on, we let ourselves be led by the people that were experts in the field. The men in England said, you put up with these people, you don't smart off to them, you be as polite as you can, don't lose your temper, because all they've got to do is cut that radio off. We don't know where they are, they know where we are.
It wasn't just guerrillas who posed a threat. The Colombian army was engaged in a full-scale war with FARC. If the army discovered the location of FARC's camp, there was a very real danger that they would launch an all-out attack, and Tom be caught in the crossfire.
So Oscar Tejeda told us how to get secure telephones like the kind that the president would use. I had one, he had one, Susan had one, so we could talk every day on a daily basis, provided we had that telephone. And it would encrypt our phone conversations and decrypt them on the other end, and somebody could tap our phones, all they got was a bunch of useless buzzes.
I would run every day. After a while, I quit that. I really didn't have the energy to do a lot of running. I certainly was not gaining weight, you know, and I was getting thinner and thinner. I thought about food all the time. I'm just fantasizing about the best meals I'd ever had. Tandoori chicken in Delhi, those 15-course meat dinners in Brazil, fried chili crabs in Sri Lanka, steamed mussels in Amsterdam, corned beef sandwiches in New York City. If I ever leave here alive, I'll never again worry about the cost of a meal.
As agreed, Sam returned with baby Sebastian to meet with Daniel.
At 4 o'clock, I took Sebastian round to Daniel's.
How's the baby?
I then thought I could have a nap while Daniel was going to be with Sebastian for a while, so I went and lay down.
Sam,
But a few minutes later,
come on, go away.
What are you talking
Just
about?
go, come on.
Daniel told me to get out of his house.
This is my time with Sebas right now. Why don't you leave? Come on, just go. Come on. I'm serious, come on.
So I didn't want an argument. I'd had enough of arguing. I went and stood outside the door. A few minutes later, I thought, this is ridiculous. I can't bring Sebastian round and stand outside a door. So I went back in.
Hey, what are you doing? Huh? Okay, come on.
And I said, I don't think this is right. I should be inside the house with Sebastian. He told me to get out again.
This is my home. It is my time, 4 hours. We have
And shouted that I'd never see Sebastian again, and he slammed the door. I was banging on the door trying to get in. and he wouldn't let me in.
Daniel, open the door! Come on! Come on! Open the door!
By this point, I was crying and really scared of what was actually going to happen.
Let me in! Daniel, open the door! Daniel! Daniel, open the door! Come on! Daniel, come on!
And then I saw Daniel running out of the house with Sebastian. He literally threw him into the car. He was 8 weeks old. He wasn't in a proper car seat. And Daniel got into the car and raced off at an incredible speed. At this point, I kept thinking he'd taken him around the block because it was so unbelievable that somebody would actually do this. I think deep down I knew he probably had taken him further, but I just kept telling myself, nobody would do it. He's not going to do it. He'll bring him back any second. Nobody's going to take a baby away from his mother. But he didn't come back. For the first time in my life, you're in a situation where there's really nothing that you can do.
I received a phone call just saying, I need to come home now. I was just told that Daniel had taken Sebastian.
I woke up to a message from my brother saying, Daniel's taken the baby.
I decided I was going to call the police because I had already decided I was going to go for custody regardless of my visa. And when the police arrived, we went into Daniel's house and then we started rummaging through things and we found some very strange notes and a map of Mexico. So we guessed he was going to Mexico with him.
With nowhere to live, Sam moved back into Daniel's house. And with the help of the Austin City Police, who overlooked her expired visa, she began to search for her baby. There was another reason for the urgency: Sebastian's intolerance to formula milk.
My greatest fear then was that Sebastian was intolerant to formula, and I wasn't there to feed him, so I didn't know what would happen to him. Within 24 to 48 hours, he could die of dehydration. If he survived one day, he may not survive the next.
Hoping that Daniel would make contact, the police hastily set up recording equipment to monitor phone calls.
While the police were still there, the phone rang and it was Daniel. He told me that I needed to go down to Mexico that day. He gave me a list of things to pack, what to do with the house, and then I would go and join him. He told me that if I told the police or my family or anyone else what he had done, then I would never see Sebastian again. I was crying and begging. I didn't know what to do. And I was just saying, please, please, like, don't do this to me. Don't threaten that I'll never see my son again. Luckily, the police detective was listening in on this phone call, so we got all these threats recorded. I was really desperate now because I realized he actually meant that if I did not do what he said, then I wouldn't see my son again.
Phil couldn't leave Gambia. The authorities still held his passport. And in just 5 days' time, he was due in court to face the verdict.
I saw that the odds were, well, stacked against me. I could see nothing but bad coming out of this. I stood to go to prison for 10 years, and I didn't like that idea.
Faced with the prospect of prison, Phil came to a decision. He would go on the run, using illegal people smugglers to get him out of the country.
You pay the right people, you take the route. Could be caught. For me, that would have been very bad news. Put in the hands of the Gambian government trying to escape. I'd lose my bail and end up in the prison.
His plan was to cross the border into Senegal, make his way to the coast and charter a boat to Sierra Leone, where he had contacts who could get him back to England. But with his trial date looming, he had just 5 days to do it.
you'd hit one tree on one side, and the vehicle would lurch the other side, and then you hit another tree, and it banks it back into the track. And this is 5 hours like this.
At the end of day 1, Phil was over the border. But now, he was entering war-torn Senegal.
So the journey was going really quite well. But the vehicle started to slow down. And you could clearly hear the anxiety amongst the people I was traveling with. First thing they said is passports, which is the one thing which I was dreading, because if I was caught, basically I'd be returned back to the Gambia. And at that point I thought, plan B, quick. If it works elsewhere, why not bribe them? It's the only thing which is going to work for me. And I thought to myself, well, they could go either way. They could either say, no, what are you doing here? Or they could take the money. I'm sure he could see I was shaking. It was my lucky day. They took the money. I thought, I've escaped one. How many more stops might there be?
Phil reached the coast. Now he needed a boat to smuggle him to Sierra Leone. But the locals were nervous.
I spent hours and hours haggling with the fishermen there. They would have run a very high risk. They didn't know who I was, what I'd done, what I was escaping from. They seemed to think the money didn't outweigh the risk, and they didn't really want to take me.
It was a severe blow. But Phil resolved to continue the escape on foot. Between him and Sierra Leone lay 300 miles of jungle, swamp, and rebel territory.
That entailed taking a bush trek through swamp area, and they're crocodile infested. I first met with mangroves, which took me hours to cross. And by then, I'd actually crossed what I guess was the borderline into Guinea-Bissau. And then I met with the other side of the river, with the other mangroves. And at that stage, I thought, there's no way I'm going to get through this. I felt beaten, really.
With just 2 days left before his trial, Phil had to face the inevitable. The escape had failed. He had no alternative but to turn back and face the court.
I took what I think was the sensible decision to turn around and go back. But the other thing which led me to that decision is I had a feeling inside me that I should go back, if only just to clear my name.
Phil was smuggled back into Gambia, just in time for Judgment Day.
I always did laundry and cleared up the flat a bit on Friday evenings before I met up with my boyfriend. I'd got home and was pottering around, and around maybe 7 o'clock or so in the evening, there was a knock on the door. And I never really had visitors round, so, you know, it wasn't like I was expecting anybody. Then the door opened just a little bit. So I shouted down, you know, who is it? And there's no reply. After about I don't know how long, but it's got to be a minute while I'm just sort of standing there frozen at the top of the stairs. I was just terrified. I had no idea of what was happening at all. One of them held me down with my face in the settee, and the other one taped up my wrists. I thought they're going to rape me or something. I felt like time had just suddenly stopped still. A few minutes later, my boyfriend opened the door with his key and came in. Obviously, this wasn't what was expected. And they put tape over my boyfriend's mouth and taped his hands and his feet. They then grabbed a big coat of mine and bundled me down the stairs and round the back. They had a camper van parked. I was put in the back of the van. I was just trying to handle this situation in any way I could. I could just see little tiny chunks of light and see the orange street lights go past. But I've never not moved so much in my life. We drove, and I lost track of time. I'd say that I even probably dozed off a bit. The next thing I then knew was we were being checked at some kind of port. I did think about raising an alarm, but the guy says, don't you dare say anything because it will mean that you'll get hurt. Other people will get hurt. I didn't say anything. We pulled off the road. Then they took me out of the car. Walked me over to a car, which, as I got close, realised had Petty standing outside of the car. So I started shrieking and yelling, saying, what on earth are you doing now? What do you think you'll get from this? Why are you doing this to me? I don't know what planet he's living on, and it's really not flattering or nice to be, you know, this wanted by anybody. That's what I thought. And he was just like, look, Joanne, you just need time to think. You will come round to, you know, to my way of thinking. You will. And I'm like, I won't.
Extradited from Russia, American executive Mark Seidenfeld was back in the Kazakh capital of Almaty on trial for fraud.
We're getting conflicting reports to the very end as to this is going to be a fair trial, this is not going to be a fair trial. I'm nervous, my lawyer's nervous, Natia's nervous.
A succession of prosecution witnesses were called to testify against Mark, all of them protégés of Anna's new owner, Murat Zanusov. At the heart of the case was the evidence of Anna's former cashier.
think one moment during the trial really stands out in my mind, which was when the cashier herself was forced to admit under the cross-examination of the judge that she had not written the complaint or the accusation on her own, but that she had been put up to it and had not even written it, had basically signed her name at the bottom of a paper that Murat's lawyers had prepared for her.
The evidence that this cashier had presented was complete rubbish, manipulated, partial information, which no accountant was going to place any value on.
Использовал деньги компании для извлечения прибыли в собственных интересах. Спасибо, Ваша честь.
Despite the fact that every single witness for the prosecution had been totally discredited, totally ripped to shreds, there was still no way to know where the trial would go, because by declaring me innocent, the judge was basically declaring the law enforcement agencies as incompetent and, in the worst case, corrupt. And that is not usually done in the former Soviet Union.
The trial was becoming a battle between Mark's word and that of the man pulling the strings behind the scenes, Murat.
We made a motion to the court that Murat must be called as a witness.
Murat Zunasov.
And the judge asked, well, where is Murat? And they said, oh, it turns out that he is running a marathon in China. The judge herself actually laughed a little bit and said, oh, sure, and nobody knew about this on Friday. Well, I guess he's just, not a man enough to come here and actually see this through.
At the end of a long week of testimony, a tangled web of false accusations and forged documentation had clouded the truth. Mark's freedom now depended on whether the judge would take an honest view of the evidence before her.
Nervous as hell. The judge starts reading, and I'm just hearing the judge recount word for word the accusation, and I'm thinking, this is not good. Oh my God, I'm going to be convicted. Natia's listening. I'm looking at her and I'm seeing that she's starting to cry.
We well knew what kind of country this was and what could be in store for us, so I couldn't be 100% sure whether he would get off or be sentenced.
Worst comes to worst, they'll send me to a penal colony. When we heard those magic words, оправдан, which is acquitted, the courtroom literally started cheering and clapping. And Mark is entitled to full compensation for moral and actual damages, which is a verdict that happens maybe 1 in 500 in the former Soviet Union.
In a legal system notorious for its corruption, Mark had been saved by an honest judge.
When the judge read the verdict of not guilty, of course I was very happy to hear it, because that is what we had all hoped for such a very long time.
As a free person, to finally be able to give her a tremendous hug. It's the hug that finally has the promise of future and freedom. The court martial, just according to protocol, is supposed to take me back down to the holding cell until my papers are signed and sealed so they can release me. And as he started to do that, the judge sees this from across the room, calls out saying, do not take him back down to the holding cell, take him straight to my chambers. I will sign the papers immediately. This guy's sat long enough, he's not going to sit a minute more.
Relieved is an understatement, right? He was pleased that he could actually walk in the open street again, that he could go and buy a pizza, he could just spend time with Natia.